Welcome to Ignatius Press Off the Shelf with myself, Father Fessio, Vivian Dudro here with me at the Ignatius Press offices in San Francisco, and Joseph Pearce in our remote office in South Carolina. We are getting close to the end of this wonderful book, Everlasting Man by J.K. Chesterton. All you see is a black, shape there because I got the cover of my hardback. But before we get to what we're going to talk about regarding this book, lest I forget again, as I've done several times, and the reason I forget is that I get interested in our conversation. I forget to do something at the end. But the next book we're going to take is this Wedding of Magdeburg by Gertrude von Lefort. And we're going to take first session will be kind of introduction by Vivian, and then the second session will be up to page 72. So if you haven't got that yet, please go out and get it now. And then now to Chesterton. We're in chapter 4 of the second part. The first part, as you recall, was the creature called man, in which at the first part of that, Chesterton shows that if you look at merely human nature and considered human beings as simply another species of animals, you'd run into absurd conclusions called reductio ad absurdum. You take a principle, man's just an animal, and you come to absurd conclusions. The first part, the first 3 chapters of part 2, the man called Christ, is the same thing. He says, if you consider Christ as a mere man, evolutionarily, it leads to absurdities. In chapter 4, so the first 3 chapters were the birth of Christ, the life and public teaching of Christ, and the death of Christ. Now comes the church. In chapter 4, called The Witness of the Heretics, he used the same argument here. He's going to say, if you looked up at the time of the church's origins, and you would try to imagine what would be a normal outcome of the situation at the time, you'd think of various things. And all of them happened, except they weren't the church. So the church can't be seen, that leads to further absurdities, as a mere result of social evolution as opposed to personal evolution, So with that, I want to turn it over to Joseph before I start interrupting him.
Well, I'm quite happy for you to be our main guide through this. You obviously know it very well. But I think the key thing of the Witness of the Heretics is that the church has been prompted to hone its doctrine in response to error. That's the Witness of the Heretics. In other words, it's error that actually allows the church to enlighten us about what the truth is. No, that's wrong. This is what's right. And I like the metaphor which we get in the first couple of pages here of the key. So 4 lines from the bottom of page 214. Only it happened to be the key that could unlock the prison of the whole world and let in the white daylight of liberty. So this key of true doctrine unlocks freedom and allows goodness, truth, and beauty to enter. And then right at the bottom, first, a key is above all things a thing with a shape and a definite shape. It is a thing that depends entirely upon keeping its shape. The Christian creed is above all things the philosophy of shapes and the enemy of shapelessness. And then the next paragraph. Second, the shape of a key is in itself a rather fantastic shape and a very elaborate shape and a very definite shape. And I think the whole point here is the word definition, that the church defines. The key is what defines and unlocks meaning so that we know what things mean as distinct to what they don't mean.
And there's a third characteristic.
Oh, yes, there. And thirdly, as the key is necessarily a thing with a pattern. So this was one having, in some ways, a rather elaborate pattern. So again, a key is not a stick, as he used further down. I mean, we're exactly here that any stick will fit in a hole, but only a key would unlock a door. That you do actually have an elaborate shape to a key, so that's the exact precise key that unlocks the precise thing which the door to meaning, shall we say.
Yes, and people accuse the church of too much complexity, your tangled trinities and so on. But the last 3 lines sums it up. It is enough to say here that there was undoubtedly much about the key that seemed complex. There was only one thing about it that was simple. It opened the door. And Joseph, this was great what you read. I was going to ask you to do that anyway. But when you began on page 214 there, only it happened to be, that really kind of presupposes what he said before. If you go, maybe 3 lines down from that paragraph, new paragraph, he says, we have now reached a point in history where something must be said of the first appearance and activities of the church in the Roman Empire. And for that brief description, nothing could be more perfect than that ancient metaphor. The early Christian was very precisely a person caring about a key, or what he said was a key. The whole Christian movement consisted in claiming to possess that key. It was not merely, here's what it's not, a vague forward movement, what do they call those things where you go on your phone and you try and start a riot or a meeting or something like that. What do they call that, Thomas? There's a name for that where you send out a text to everybody, let's go here and burn the car down or something like that.
No, a flash mob.
Flash mob, yeah. It wasn't a, thank you, Thomas. It wasn't a flash mob. It was not merely a vague forward movement, which might be better represented by a battering ram. It was not something that swept along with it similar or dissimilar things, as does a modern social movement. As we shall see in a moment, it rather definitely refused to do so. It definitely asserted that there was a key, and that it possessed that key, and that no other key was like it. In that sense, it was as narrow as you please, because we're accused of that too, complexity and narrowness. Only it happened to be the key that could unlock the prison of the whole world and let in the white day of liberty. That's just, so those together, what you read and what I read, Joseph, I think, describes well that metaphor of the key, which again, 2,000 years have gone by. I don't think anybody's really focused on the symbolic meaning of the church as a key. We got the key of St. Peter and so on, but I haven't seen it or heard of it unpacked like this, where he really takes the key. What is the key after all, and how that fits the church?
Yeah, I do actually, because we keep going backwards, which is nothing wrong with that. But right at the very beginning there of the chapter, Christ founded the church with 2 great figures of speech. The first was the phrase about founding on Peter as on a rock. The second was the symbol of the keys. So again, Peter, of course, is the holder of the keys, as well as being the rock. And those 2 metaphors, those 2 figures of speech, that the church is a rock and the church is holding the key.
Yes.
Well, then he goes into, Father, where you started from, demonstrating that Christianity could not have just been some stage of evolution,
Right.
growing out of what was there in some organic, predictable way, that it was something completely different. And he expounds on that now for a few pages, and does so, I think, very convincingly. For example, on page 216, people who say it arose in an age of barbarism, first of all, he corrects the record on that it arose in a highly advanced civilization, the Roman Empire. And so, if anything, rather than being a step of progress of a civilization progressing, he goes to point out that really this was an old civilization on its way down. And Christianity emerges out of that.
On page, exactly right. On page 217, about 12 lines up there, you see, it was certainly not in the least like merely ethical and idealistic movements in our time. It had a doctrine, it had a discipline, it had sacraments, it had degrees of initiation, it admitted people and expelled people, it affirmed one dogma with authority and reputed another with anathemas. If all these things be the mark of the Antichrist, the reign of Antichrist followed very rapidly upon the Christ. Because here's what happened, especially in the 19th century, but even in the 17th, or the 16th for that matter, there was this idea very prominent that, well, the Catholic Church began as a simple love of Christ and love your neighbor, and movement of people who were very enthusiastic and so on. But then it became organized and became institutionalized and became more complexified, and it added doctrines and discipline and became more and more and more complex. So the church, the Catholic Church, it would be said, is a declination of, or a devolvement from, or a corruption of this, the Bible, what the Bible tells us, and just being a disciple of Christ. He says at the bottom, where I just read the new paragraph at the bottom, those who maintain that Christianity was not a church, but a moral movement idealist have been forced to push the period of its perversion or disappearance further and further back. Now, this is something which is historically verifiable, that especially in the 19th century, they accepted this principle. Oh, well, the Catholic Church is just an accretion of human complex doctrines and disciplines on what was really a simple, basic me and Jesus movement, Well, those scholars then kept finding, when did it start? And did they start with Constantine, in the 300s? Well, yeah, we see structure. Well, let's go back further. Well, they get then Ignatius of Antioch, who's writing in the year 110. Oh my gosh, they got priests, deacons, and bishops there already, so they kept going back and back further until finally the scholars themselves, discovered all the elements of a structured church at Pentecost, or even
Right.
before.
Which is not to say that the church has gone through cycles of accretions and corruptions that then leads to a jadedness, and then leads to some kind of need for revival, renewal. The church is always in need of renewal, right? But the mistake here is that somehow, if you go back far enough, you'll get to the point where even these things that are absolutely essential, dogma, authority, sacraments, the real presence of the Eucharist, the real presence of God in the Eucharist, these kinds of things were there from the get-go, as far back as you want to go. And in fact, it's this discovery that has led so many great Protestant minds, maybe I should call them Catholic minds, they just didn't know they were Catholic, into the church. People like Newman, people like, what was the old saying? If you start, maybe Joseph, you can correct me, if you start reading the fathers of the church, the earliest writings of the church, you're just about doomed to become a Catholic, right? Because
Newman said, that was you're getting to, but to go deeper and deeper into history to become a Catholic.
Right. Right. Which is not to say there haven't been times, like I said, where the church did get, I don't know, in need of a bit of pruning. But when, but the discernment that's needed to make sure that what you're not doing is cutting off necessary limbs, or like you, Joseph, you've used many times the metaphor of the pruning the tree to try to find the sapling,
Right.
which is impossible. So, but still, there are times, and he mentions them where he mentions them in the course of the next chapters, that there have been times when the church needed correctives.
Yeah, in fact, 5 times he mentions it, but
5 times. There you go. The 5 heresies.
5 deaths of the faith. But
Yes.
It's important. Here's just a historical note that in the early 20th century, late 19th century, there was this search for the historical Jesus, because Christ, they said, was layer upon layer of interpretations put upon him by the authors of the New Testament. But what are the ipsissima verba? What did Jesus really say? And they try and exegetically determine, well, no, this had to have been added later. We think this is what he actually said. So they're trying to find the real Jesus, and take away the encumberments of what we call the superstructure that added on there. And as Ratzinger points out, Benedict points out in his wonderful Jesus of Nazareth, what they found out was that turns out that the real historical Jesus is the Christ that we get from scriptures. The scriptures give us the true story. Well, likewise with the church, they said, well, what's the real church? Let's get rid of the Pope, first of all. Let's get rid of bishops. So you get rid of the Pope, you get Episcopalians. I mean, Episcopos is a bishop. Well, no, we don't want that. Let's just go to priests. That's Presbyterians. Get rid of the bishops. Now you got the priests. No, let's go to them. Let's be Congregationalists. I mean, they're trying to peel it all away.
Yes.
But the more you go back into history, the more you find out, well, actually, there was a Pope, and there were bishops, and there were priests from early on.
Yep.
I have someone 219, but what was it?
The perversion of a movement you have in your notes.
Okay. The new paragraph on page 219. We may begin then with these two negations. It is nonsense to say that the Christian faith appeared in a simple age, in the sense of an unlettered and gullible age. It is equally nonsense to say that Christian faith was a simple thing, in the sense of a vague or childish or instinctive thing. So that just summarizes what we've already said.
Mm-hmm.
Bottom of the page there. At the beginning of the book, new paragraph, I ventured on a general summary of it in a parallel between the rise of humanity out of nature and the rise of Christianity out of history. I pointed out that in both cases, what had gone before might imply something coming after, but did not in the least imply what did come after.
Mm-hmm.
If a detached mind had seen certain apes, it might have deduced more anthropoids. It would not have deduced man or anything within 1,000 miles of what man has done. So, further down about 10 lines. Now, this earlier explanation must be kept in mind because it is exact parallel to the true view of the church and the suggestion of it having evolved naturally out of the empire and decay. So, that just kind of his words of what I summarized at the beginning.
Mm-hmm. And then he goes into the 5 deaths of the church, and it would be helpful maybe if somebody could just summarize them. Father has a list here.
I can do that because basically Chesterton is saying, well, if you looked at the culture and the mores and movements around the time of, let's say, the 1st century after Christ, you could see certain things coming from that. One, after this hedonistic, where the Roman Empire becomes so, pleasure-seeking, you might expect a reaction of asceticism, harsh asceticism. And there was. There's Manichaeanism. And then a few centuries later, there's Islam. But you can't explain the church by saying it's a reaction to pleasure, because those which were reactions were condemned by the church, Manichaeanism and Islam. A second possible evolutionary option would be, things aren't so complex. You're looking for something more spiritual, more detached, more otherworldly. And the church has been accused of that. But it also happened at this time, Mithraism and other Eastern religions, but the church condemned those. Third thing, they say, well, of course, this time the Roman Empire, covered the whole world, and the emperor, he made Christianity the state religion. 372, Theodosius, I think. So that's what explains why the church began and persevered. But you said, wait a minute, the next emperor made Arianism, Arian Christianity, the state religion, and the church condemned that. This is the 4th century. And then the fourth thing, he mentions a lapse into superstition, something like that. That was a fourth possible option, but the church condemned mere superstition. And then there's 2 others. After the decay of Hellenism, Greek philosophy and so on, there might have been a return to Hebrewism, or which is like Islam was. And this other one is kind of similar to the first one, that a rigorism, after laxity in the Roman Empire, you get a rigorism. but that was Tertullian, who said, "Credo qui absurdum," I believe because it's absurd. Extra ecclesiam nulla salus est, outside the church, no salvation, which has a true meaning. But anyway, the four evolutionary options then are a reaction to pleasure, a desire for a more Oriental religion, more spiritual, state approval, and a superstition. I think that's how I summarized it, but maybe you want to clarify or correct any of that. I don't know.
Yes, my list, it was Manichaeanism, Mithraism, Arianism, and Islam, which is what you listed as well. And in each case, as you said, Father, these were reactions. These were reactionary, if you will, movements. And I think the fact that they were all condemned by the church, Chesterton is trying to demonstrate that Christianity was not a reactionary movement that could have been foreseen by the social situation of the time. That Christianity was something completely different.
And not only different, but it condemned the reactionary movement.
Condemned them and offered what he calls the next chapter, the escape from paganism. Christianity was not only the key that unlocked the door, the Christ who came into the world, whose words convert minds and hearts when you read them with an open mind and heart, and was the only escape from paganism, which is the human default position.
As we'll see, yeah.
As we'll see.
There is just one thing. If maybe I could just read towards the bottom of page 227, this idea of the church being dogmatic and on apparently obscure issues about the Trinity. So about 10 lines up from the bottom of page 227. If there is one question which the enlightened and liberal have the habit of deriding and holding up as a dreadful example of barren dogma and senseless sectarian strife, it is this Athanasian question of the co-eternity of the divine Son. On the other hand, if there's one thing that the same liberals always offer us as a piece of pure and simple Christianity, untroubled by doctrinal disputes, it is the single sentence, God is love. Yet the two statements are almost identical. At least one is very nearly nonsense without the other. The barren dogma is only the logical way of stating the beautiful sentiment. For if there be a being without beginning, existing before all things, was he loving when there was nothing to be loved? There's a perfect example of Chesterton's brilliance here, and there's a wonderful dialogue which Ignatius Press published. Platitudes Undone, I think you published that. It was a dialogue between Chesterton and Holbrook Jackson, the relativist, and Holbrook Jackson said that theology and religion not the same thing. When theologians take over, religious people stay away. And Chesterton responded, theology is merely that part of religion that requires brains. And here we see it there, right? Exactly. It. Doctrine is merely that part of religion that requires brains. The use of reason.
Would you read a few more lines from where you stopped?
Yeah, I'll carry on until you stop me. If through that unthinkable eternity he is lonely, what is the meaning of saying he is love?
Mm-hmm.
The only justification of such a mystery is the mystical conception that in his own nature there is something analogous to self-expression, something of what begets and beholds what it has begotten. Without some such idea, it is really illogical to complicate the ultimate essence of deity with an idea like love. If the moderns really want a simple religion of love, they must look for it in the Athanasian Creed.
Mm-hmm. That is so theologically profound.
Mm-hmm.
And yet again, this man who's not a theologian
Right.
puts it in this succinct, paradoxical, but absolutely comprehensible way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he is a theologian of the Trinity right here. It's phenomenal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It is beautiful. Absolutely beautiful.
And I would just like to point out that, his use of the word liberal here,
Yeah, good point.
later on, he uses the word liberal to mean something very different and explains that it's really the church that's truly liberal in the sense of giving man his free will. And that the people who claim to be liberals are actually the people trying to deny his free will, both in his nature as a man to start, and then in all of the things that they saddle mankind with to make him do what they want him to do. And I love the fact that he can use the word in both places. But what I really find interesting about him is that like he says on 241, there will be no end to the weary debates about liberalizing theology, which is what he was talking about, Joseph, with the use of liberal you just quoted, until people face the fact that the only liberal part of it is really the dogmatic part. And now this is the second sense of how he uses this word, meaning those who truly respect human freedom. And let's face it, no freedom, no love.
Well, also, no doctrine or no discipline, no freedom. This sort of wonderful example, which I've actually used myself earlier on in my teaching career, that, you want to be free to drive wherever you want on the street, left or right-hand side or the middle. Well, all of a sudden you get in an accident, right? But if we say, look, we're going to say you drive on the right-hand side only, or left-hand side of England, but I mean, here in the United States, trying to say, because you've imposed that doctrine, that discipline, that rule, now you can be free.
Yes.
You don't have to drive a tank just to make sure you're not getting in a collision. You can drive a scooter or something like that.
I thought that's what Tesla trucks were for.
That's true. Joseph, we're getting close. I would like you to, I think we'd sum up this whole chapter if you read just the first 10, 12 lines on page 323.
320, sorry?
No, he means 2. He means 223.
223, sorry. I could.
223.
Sorry.
What really happened was this. When the faith first emerged into the world, the very first thing that happened to it was that it was caught in a sort of swarm of mystical and metaphysical sects, mostly out of the East. Like one lonely golden bee caught in a swarm of wasps. To the ordinary onlooker, there did not seem to be much difference, or anything beyond a general buzz. Indeed, in a sense, there was not much difference so far as stinging and being stung were concerned. The difference was that only one golden dot in all that whirring gold dust had the power of going forth to make hives for all humanity, to give the world honey and wax, or, as was so finely said in the context too easily forgotten, the two noblest things, which are sweetness and light.
Right. So that, I mean, again, that's kind of a metaphor that he uses of the bees buzzing, but that's again how he's looking at the declining Roman Empire and these new thoughts, movements, religions, and so on. It was all just a maelstrom of the buzz of the bees, but there was that one bee that looked like all the rest, but it wasn't.
So you have to look a little deeper to see what things really are.
Yeah. Right. And we'll do that in the next. I think we're going to conclude this one because we're right at the end of a chapter and we're kind of out of our time. So thanks all. We'll see you next session.